Hey, you're watching my official compilation channel, but if you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're uploaded, check out my main channel, Chat History. Alright, enjoy the video. Embarrassing royal deaths. This is Louis III, and this is his dad, Louis II, King of West Francia, also known as the Kingdom of the Franks. Hey Frank. Hey Frank. Louis II here is renowned for being a very peaceful and very loving ruler for his very short 2-year reign between the years of 877 and 879. And now, he's dead, which is even more peaceful. Now, Louis III is the king-to-be at the ripe old age of 16. But since his parents married in secret before he was slopped out, his claim to the throne is being questioned. Now, in order to keep things civil, Louis had struck a deal with his younger brother to rule together. And with that agreement, West Francia was split in two. Okay, this is my half, and there's yours. Fine by me. My side has the Xbox. Louis III got the north, and his brother, Carloman II, got the south. Together, the two brothers fought off any would-be usurpers from East Francia who contested their reign. Battles were fought for over a year with some back and forth, but ultimately ended in a loss, and a portion of their kingdom was ceded to the east. But while East Francia celebrated its victory, a distant threat loomed over the horizon. Those dang Vikings were showing up in 881 and began to pillage the village and plunder asunder. However, East Francia, still riding their high, managed to kick the Vikings' shit in. Not wanting to sail their ships home in shame, the Vikings instead tried their luck with West Francia. Bad move. They would soon learn that two kings were better than Vikings. Louis and Carloman went on the offensive and took the invaders by surprise. Together, the brother armies slaughtered the Vikings, cutting down around 9,000 men in the clash. This victory was absolutely huge for the two young monarchs, who were praised by both Western and Eastern Frankish kingdoms. Now keep in mind that both kings were teenagers, so the ego trip was insane. That being the case, Louis took to finding himself a queen, as to produce an heir and to cement his legacy. Louis decided to pursue love in 882 and ended up quite literally pursuing a potential partner. In a bout of hopefully consensual horseplay, the young maiden fled from the eager monarch on horseback to her father's house.
Why are you running?
Louis, very calmly hunting down his love interest, ended up completely conking his dome on the top of a low doorway. That's certainly one way to get head. And since he had yet to sow his seed, his younger brother was left to rule on his own. Well, he died 2 years later after being accidentally stabbed by his servant during a hunting trip. Bummer. Little Basil I was quite the inspirational success story. Born into a dirt-poor Armenian family in the Byzantine province of Macedonia way back in 811, baby Basil had quite the social ladder to climb. But such a challenge was deemed necessary as he was determined to dodge his destitute destiny. Too bad that he and his family were captured by Bulgarians when he was just 2. Luckily, Basil was able to escape his captors. It just took 23 years. He sought to live out his newfound freedom and fled to Constantinople, which is not yet Istanbul. Possessing incredible strength and an uncanny ability to roll 20s on any and all charisma checks, Basil made leaps and bounds up that social ladder. He began working as a lowly stable boy, got promoted to servant under a relative of the emperor, met a wealthy cougar noblewoman who just threw money at him, dabbled in sweaty, slippery wrestling, and then took on a gig as a bodyguard for Supreme Empire King Emperor guy Michael III. Now, you'd figure that being a bodyguard to the emperor would be a great place to coast until retirement, but Basil was just getting started. He managed to gain the utmost trust of the emperor, even being formally adopted as a son. And taking advantage of this, Emperor Mikey had been convinced by Basil that his own uncle was secretly plotting to take the throne, so he gave Basil permission to address the issue. He did. This false act of loyalty resulted in the emperor crowning Basil as co-emperor, which was not his best move. You see, Emperor Michael III wasn't very good in his decision-making, which is probably why the public didn't favor him all that much. Basil had one last obstacle in the way of the crown: his newly adoptive dad. But that's nothing a quick swipe of a sword can't fix. Basil dropped the "co" in his title and was now the full-fledged emperor of the Byzantine Empire in 867. Despite having 0 qualifications for the job, Basil's establishment of the Macedonian dynasty brought the Byzantine Empire into a golden age, with various military victories, large-scale construction, and significant cultural and legal reforms. Problem is, when you get into power through murder, you're always going to be looking over your shoulder for the next person trying to do the same thing to you. Now, I'm not going to question the logistics of it, but during a routine hunting hunting trip in 886, the now elderly Basil managed to get his belt stuck in a deer's antlers. Yeah, I don't know. The animal went wild, as animals tend to do, dragging Basil across the Windows XP default landscape for 16 whole miles. That's at least 2 kilometers. A servant had managed to cut the Emperor free, but the damage was done. Although somehow still alive, the Emperor sustained tremendous injury. The servant, still brandishing his iconic belt-cutting knife, was accused of attempted murder and was sentenced to death. Wait, what? Emperor Basil I died a bit later from his infected wounds. Old Edmund Ironside was King of England for a whole 7 months in 1016 after his rad dad Athelred II died under unknown circumstances. Poor Edmund rose to power at a pretty bad time. Those gosh damn Vikings were gaining a foothold in England, and they needed a stern talking to at the very least.
Not just any Vikings though, these were Danish Vikings, which were much more formidable, flaky, and flavorful.
The 26-year-old king fought back hard against the Viking invaders, throwing whatever English forces he could at them, and saw quite a few victories, granting the king the nickname Ironside for his resilience. But even though he won a few battles, he had yet to win the war. The final conflict, the Battle of Essendon, near modern-day Essex, ended in Danish victory, where there was much rejoicing and many crumbs. Following this English loss, a treaty was signed by King Edmund and Viking King Canute.
Canute, being a real canunt, agreed to allow Edmund to continue his reign, but only with the control of Wessex, the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. All English land north of the River Thames was now under Danish control. Now, there was a special stipulation that stated whichever king died first, the other shall inherit the whole country.
That sounds like great motivation for assassination plots. Lo and behold, just 1 month later in October of 1016, Edmund Ironside met with a terrible fate. While sitting on his second most important throne, an assailant was assigned to assassinate the king's ass. Yep, old Ironsides caught a blade between his cheeks when he was at his most vulnerable. According to some historical sources, an assassin hid under the king's private turlet, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Edmund, as planned, died of his wounds, granting King Canute full control over England, which he ruled for 2 decades. Being the youngest son of 4 to William the Conqueror, Henry I didn't even have a chance of becoming a Burger King, let alone any kind of respected monarch. When Daddy William logged off the server in 1087, the late king's possessions were divided as such. His eldest son, Robert, inherited Normandy and was made duke. His second son, Richard, got nothing. He was dead. From a hunting accident, no less. His third and favorite son, William, inherited the crown of England and was begrudgingly promoted to King William II overnight. I say begrudgingly because it is believed that William II would have preferred to inherit Normandy. Oh well. Finally, little Henry was given lots of money and a tiny bit of English countryside. But that was immediately yoinked by his now king brother, which never caused any internal resentment in the coming years. Now, some historians believe that King William 2.0 didn't care much for his new majestic role, and as a means of escape from his kingly duties, he frequently went on hunting trips. You can probably see where this is going. During one of these trips, William, who wasn't much of an adventurer, took an arrow in the chest. Now, since lungs aren't where arrows are usually stored, William quivered in pain as the arrow knocked the wind out of him, and he drew his last breath shortly after. Yeah, hunting trips are lethal to nobility. Of course, some historical speculations suggest that the friendly fire may not have been so friendly. It is possible that the fiasco was a plot concocted by Henry to seize the crown. After hearing of his older brother's demise through his own ear holes, Henry speed ran to the royal treasury and no-clipped to the crown to claim the throne for himself, which certainly didn't help dispel the rumors of foul play. Now, the public wasn't exactly against what had happened, as King William II was a bit of a dick. As the new head honcho, King Henry I immediately began a rollback on many of his late brother's brutal policies, replacing them with much more successful judicial and financial reforms. Being the most educated of the 4 brothers, Henry peacefully ruled England and progressed the kingdom during his reign. Sure, he also invaded Normandy and held his last brother prisoner for life, but that's beside the point. Henry eventually married a Scottish princess and had himself 2 legitimate children that he loved very much, and dozens of illegitimate little crotch goblins whom he didn't.
Daddy, I want a popsicle.
Now, of course, there has to be a little bit of conflict sprinkled in, so his son and only heir got caught up in the White Ship disaster of 1120, which was a titanic tragedy. The titular White Ship, a vessel transporting around 300 people, including many nobles, struck a big old boulder and sank in the English Channel. Only one soul survived, but it wasn't the prince, so who cares? This sent Henry into a depressive spiral, as many of his subjects refused to recognize his daughter as a rightful heir to the crown. A woman ruling? Ugh, gross, said the English. In his sad state, Henry cheered himself up the only way a king knows how, with a good old-fashioned hunting trip. But on this trip, Henry gorged himself on lamprey. You know, those weird little wiggly sucking teeth fish? Yeah, apparently those were a delicacy. Despite numerous warnings from his physician to cut it out, Henry continued to chew through the little suckers like candy. Your Majesty, that's a bit much, isn't it? King Henry I contracted food poisoning and died from the illness a week later in 1135 at the age of 66, bringing an end to the Norman dynasty. King Charles II was an asshole, which is why history remembers him as Charles the Bad. Having been born and raised in France and descending from a line of French rulers, Charles felt destined to be the big baguette in charge one day, and when his mother, who was the only daughter of former King Louis X of France, faded from existence, Charles received his inheritance, the paltry kingdom of Navarre, a pathetic spit of land in northern modern-day Spain. This sad excuse for a kingdom was an insult to his name, an insult he would never forget. Although now a king at the age of 17, Charles continued to spend his time in France, hoping to build enough influence to gain recognition for his claim to the crown. But he wasn't successful. He would spend the next several decades double-crossing, manipulating, and backstabbing his way through life, pitting England and France against each other during the 100 Years' War. He had deceived, murdered, and betrayed for the sake of gaining power. He eventually helped spark a revolution in France. No, not the French Revolution. That's not for a while. This uprising was the Jacquerie, a peasant rebellion in 1358 against French nobles. Charles led a suppressive force against the peasants to appear to be the savior of France, but everyone saw right through the ruse. After that publicity stunt, Charles lost almost all political support in France and had to turn to England for help. He ended up pleading with English King Dude Guy Edward III to invade the weakened France and divide the spoils between them, but King Edward was all, no. The king had zero trust for Charles and refused the offer, eventually making peace with France. For now. A few years later, Charles was back on his bullshit, throwing himself in wars and declaring loyalty to both sides in exchange for gaining land and power. He would just favor whichever side was winning. He did get involved in the Spanish Wars between 1365 and 1368, but faked his own kidnapping in order to avoid participating in battle. And that stunt was instantly recognized as cowardice, making Charles a laughingstock of Western Europe. Finally, in 1378, the annoying little fly that was Charlie II was finally swatted. His tiny kingdom was invaded by Spanish forces and promptly wiped out. Charles sought refuge in France and was forced to surrender in shame. Although he retained his crown, he had no power whatsoever. 9 years later in 1387, Charles the Bad fell ill and was pretty much immobile. His doctor prescribed that his body be wrapped in alcohol-soaked linen sheets, and these sheets were sewn around his body each night to promote any healing. Well, one night when finishing up her king sewing duties, a maid had no scissors to cut the last thread of the linen. There were no blades to be found that could finish the job. So, what do you think she did? Time's up. The correct answer was B. In a moment of completely terrible judgment, the young maid resorted to using an open flame candle to melt the thread off. Charles II, who wanted to be a French king so bad, was promptly flambéed in his bed as the maid panicked and fled. Henry II of France was a decent king between the years of 1547 up until his death in 1559. Nothing spectacular, but decent. He's remembered as an advocate for keeping the Catholic faith in France and suppressing them smelly Protestants. He had quite a few either burned at the stake for heresy or had their tongues cut out so they couldn't talk trash about Catholicism. Perhaps his bigger claim to fame, though, was his participation in ending the Italian Wars, which waged across 65 years. With the signing of the Treaty of Compilations, the deadly wars were finally at an end, and there was much rejoicing. One particular event of celebration was conducted by our subject, King Henry II. To commemorate the end of the wars, as well as his daughter's marriage to King Philip II of Spain, Henry held a jousting tournament. You know, that silly medieval sport where two men hold long wooden poles on horseback and just charge at each other trying to knock the other off. Yeah, I don't get it either, but hey, it's way more entertaining than baseball. Anyway, King Henry II held the tournament on June 30th, 1559 and took it upon himself to participate as a challenger. Perhaps the last bad decision of his life. Set against his own captain of the King's Guard, the two set off to consensually jab their long sticks into each other. With the ASMR pleasures of a wooden crunch, the captain's lance hit its target and shattered upon impact, as they're designed to do. Problem was, some of the splintered wood decided to nuzzle itself right into the king's eyeball for warmth.
Oh my god, okay, I'm sorry, you're fine, you're okay.
Royal surgeons raced to the king's aid, but were unable to treat the wound.
He's gonna be okay, right, Doc?
Tough to say. Problem seems to be this big old piece of wood here. I highly recommend he rest up for a few days and we'll see what happens.
Aren't you gonna remove the wood?
I'm sorry, I was unaware that you were the royal surgeon. The medics failed to properly treat the king's wounds, which only got worse over the next few days, leading to severe infection. I may have been wrong. King Henry II splintered off from this world on June 10th, 1559. The silliest deaths in history. Sometimes it's your own pride that can get the best of you. This is Hans Steininger, and this is his beard. Hey, my eyes are up here. Looking like the wisest wizard in the world, Hans was a public spectacle in the 16th century and also a well-respected politician. Cause, I mean, come on, who are you gonna vote for? Majestic and marvelous beard boy Hans, or the lame and lackluster clean-shaven Franz? Und that is how I will be lowering taxes while simultaneously providing affordable healthcare and housing for all. Alright, but where's your beard? I don't have one.
This guy stinks!
But behind that big bushel of bristles beats a kind heart, one that legitimately cared for his town and its people. So much so that Hans was elected as mayor for 6 consecutive terms for the town of Braunau am Inn, a town that resides on the border between modern-day Austria and Germany. It's also the birthplace of another famous facial hair haver, albeit far less loved by history, but that's another story. Measuring in at over 4.5 feet in length, Hans's big-ass beard was his defining feature, and was certainly a testament to his patience and care in many aspects in his life. If you can brush your beard, you can untangle legislative issues. If you can oil up your whiskers, you can lubricate the political machine. So it goes without saying that cosmetology and political science are of equal value. At least from a college degree standpoint. However, Hans's biggest asset would be his downfall, quite literally. On September 28, 1567, a fire broke out in the town, which was a much bigger threat back then than it is today. Since the extent of firefighting tactics were just pathetic pails of water, a single small fire could reduce your whole town to cinders real quick. Hans, who usually tucked his beloved beard into a leather pouch for safekeeping and uninhibited travel, let his lusciously long locks whimsically whip in the wind as he ran to help with the fire. Scuttling down some stairs in a panic, Hans had accidentally slammed a piggy right on his own facial pubes, causing him to slip and trip down the entire staircase. He snapped his neck, and the town was devastated. Not by the fire, but by the loss of their beloved mayor. Before being buried, the townsfolk had Hans's beard gently removed and chemically preserved, immortalizing his legacy. The forever facial hair is still on display in a museum in the town today. You know his ghost is pissed, though. Ever have an extreme case of the sleepy ha-has where you find anything and everything to be complete comedic gold to the point of not being able to even breathe? Now try to imagine this soggy scoop of Cheerios doing that. This is Chrysippus, a rather influential Greek Stoic philosopher in the 3rd century BC. In case you don't peruse that corner of YouTube, Stoicism is the philosophy that you only ever need to focus on what you can control in your life. Anything reasonably outside of that control, Hakunas Matatis, not my problemas. Which is a pretty solid philosophy, especially in this age of doom and gloom social media designed to make you perpetually paranoid and pissed off. Chrysippus was also a huge proponent of logical reasoning, having created an original system of propositional logic, stuff like if, then, and or statements that we use to describe the world around us today. For example, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then you're dead to me. Simple logic. The basic idea is that any and all things happen for a reason. Well, I'm sure Chrysippus would have a hard time understanding the logic and reasoning surrounding his rather untimely death. According to legend, Chrysippus, at the fermented old age of 73, got trashed at a feast. In his slizzard state, he had stumbled upon a donkey who was munching on some figs. Registering at least a 6.9 on the ancient Greek comedy scale, the masticating mule was a hilarious sight to behold, prompting Chrysippus to exclaim, quote, "Now give the donkey some pure wine to wash down the figs." This added punchline sent the Lord of Logic over the edge. Chrysippus reportedly hurled himself into a fit of laughter so intense that he had collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Despite some nearby partygoers attempting to help him, he had knocked himself dead with his own joke. But the question is, can you actually die from laughter? Sure you can. It's rare, but medically possible. If you laugh your ass off to the point of it being an uncontrollable fit, that actually puts a lot of stress on your heart. So if you have a weak heart, you're probably going to exacerbate some underlying conditions, leading to a heart attack. You also have the possibility of losing consciousness if you laugh yourself out of breath for long enough. But you have to hear or see something exceptionally funny for that to happen, so don't worry, you're safe here. Now, of course, this recount of events is debated by historians. The guy who documented this particular death was ancient Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived a few hundred years after Chrysippus' death, so he was far from an eyewitness. Diogenes nuts! On top of that, he also wrote an alternative, more mundane account of the comical death, simply writing that Chrysippus died of alcohol poisoning after drinking too much undiluted wine, but I guess he needed to spice some things up for his readers. If there was ever proof that the universe has a cruel sense of humor, then it's the curious case of American lawyer and politician Clement Vallandigham. Howdy. Though he resided in the Union state of Ohio during the mid-1800s, Clement was adamantly against the Civil War, calling it, quote, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. Which is fine, but being a member of the Copperhead faction of the anti-war Democrats, Clement was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer, speaking out against President Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, to which Lincoln was all and sent him to the South to live amongst his Confederate companions in 1863. Clement, who was clearly not about that life, snuck aboard a ship and shipped himself off to Canada before sneaking back to his home state of Ohio to perform rather inconsequential political mumbo-jumbo for the next few years. But after the war was over, Clement attempted to run on political platforms while still advocating for slavery. However, he suddenly switched his views with the Democratic New Departure policy of 1865, which basically 180'd the Democratic Party's stance on slavery once they realized that it fell out of favor in the public's eye. So, being branded as a no-good slavery supporter for life meant the figurative death of his political career. Instead, he turned to a career in law, which would soon lead to his literal death. On June 17, 1871, Vallandigham met his demise while defending his client, Thomas McGeehan, a young fella accused of shooting and killing one Tommy Myers. Clement claimed that Myers had, in fact, not been murdered but accidentally shot himself with his own gun while getting up to stand. Clement vowed that he could demonstrate this before the court, proving McGeehan's innocence. And so he did. Now, when reenacting a scene that results in someone accidentally blowing a hole through their own tummy, you want to make sure that you have safety measures in place that would physically prevent you from doing the same thing. Clement didn't do that. Instead, he had mistakenly used a loaded pistol. While demonstrating the scene as Myers, Clement attempted to draw the seemingly harmless firearm from his coat pocket as he stood up. And he blew a hole through his own tummy, just like Myers. Clement Vallandigham died just 12 hours later from his injuries. The verdict? Not guilty. McGeehan was acquitted and was a free man. Until he was murdered a few years later, that is. You can tempt death all you like, but eventually, he's gonna get what's his. That's what big ol' Bobby Leach found out in 1926. Born in itty-bitty Britain, England in 1858, Leach grew up to be quite the daredevil. Unfortunately, most of Bobby's early life is lost to time, completely shrouded in mystery. We do know that around the 1880s, he had left boring old England for a more exhilarating life in the States. Apparently an excellent swimmer, Leach eventually landed a gig as a professional high diver with the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. There, he performed daringly dangerous feats in front of thousands of eager onlookers. This had quenched the adrenaline-thirsty void in his life for a while, but eventually he retired from this circus life at the age of 50 in order to extend his life expectancy a bit. But that logic was tossed aside rather quickly, as in the early 1900s, Bobby decided to settle down as a humble businessman at Niagara Falls.
Blimey, that's a proper waterfall, isn't it?
Initially content with just opening up a restaurant, Leach noticed the ever-increasing tourists flocking from afar to see a bunch of water spill over a cliff. So, this gave him an idea. The Daredevil was back. Between 1906 and 1911, Leach performed various stunts around the falls, including parachuting from the nearby Honeymoon Bridge to the river below. Over the years, Leach continued to push the envelope, coming up with more and more dangerous stunts to draw larger and larger crowds. Eventually, he faced his biggest challenge, the falls themselves. And on July 25th, 1911, entombed in a customized giant metal barrel, Leach took the plunge. And survived. Sure, he had gashed his forehead, broken his jaw, and all of his kneecaps, but he was still kicking. Bobby Leach became the second person to survive the trip, right behind 63-year-old Annie Taylor. After recovering in the hospital for several months, Leach became a celebrity. Over the next several years, he had plans to make a second bound over the falls, but it never came to be. Why? Well, because in 1926 he went and slipped on a dang orange peel, snapping his leg in half, which went and got infected with gangrene, ultimately killing him a few days later. Remember that death always gets the last laugh. Having served the shortest presidential term in United States history, you know something must have gone down. Well, it was President William Henry Harrison's health bar. The withering president had a pretty impressive career before assuming office. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1791 at the age of 18 and quickly rose through the ranks, serving in the American Indian Wars, which sought to expand U.S. territory further west against native tribes, which they did. Satisfied with his service, Harrison decided to retire from the military at 25 and toss his hat in the ring for a career in politics. Recognized for his leadership skills on the battlefield, then President Guy John Adams gave Harrison control over the territory of Indiana as governor, with the goal of expanding that territory for statehood eligibility. One consequence of this territorial expansion was the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which only further displaced natives from the area in order to allow more settlers to, well, settle. This success cemented Harrison's legacy, as Indiana would eventually become its own state in 1816. But leading military campaigns from afar, that's boring as shit. Harrison missed being in the middle of the action, so he came out from his military retirement to fight in the War of 1812, serving as a major general for the US Army against the smelly redcoats, who weren't too happy seeing the US's throbbing expansion. A bunch of people died, and the war ended in pretty much a stalemate, but the outcome solidified the US as a world power, being able to at least defend itself from a foreign power. This really boosted national morale and pride, and with no restrictions put in place, the US just kept on manifesting that destiny in the coming years. Now back in a time of peace and having successfully satisfied his war boner, Harrison fell back into politics, serving in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and eventually running for president. His opponent was 8th President Martin Van Buren, whose first term experienced an economic depression with the Panic of 1837. Of course, Van Buren was given the blame for the economic downturn, even though it began over a month before he was even in office. The economy stagnated, unemployment rose, and the people were properly pissed. So it's no surprise that when seeking re-election, it was now Harrison who would be the favorite to win. Aww. Harrison won in a landslide, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60, but that wouldn't matter in about a month. Elected in 1841 at the age of 68, Harrison was getting on in his years. Either a stubborn old goat or a complete idiot, he had the habit of being extremely underprepared for the weather. For example, he delivered his inaugural speech in the bitter cold and rain for 2 hours straight, with no overcoat or weather-appropriate clothes.
Connected with the subject is the character of the currency. The idea of making it exclusively metallic, however well intended, appears to me to be fraught with...
Oh, this is gonna suck. Harrison continued to endure exposure to the elements over the next few weeks, eventually contracting a deadly case of pneumonia. Despite his doctors jacking him to the tits with drugs and relying on good old-fashioned bloodletting, Harrison died on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after being elected. When you were a kid, did you ever try jumping off of a sofa using a blanket as a makeshift parachute, but you failed to calculate if the blanket had the proper coefficient of drag necessary to minimize your acceleration due to gravity, leaving you crashing to the floor in a possible concussion? Just me? Well, take that scenario and scale it up to adult size, except this is your blanket, and this is your couch. Meet Franz Reichelt, the mastermind behind the parachute suit prototype. An Austro-Hungarian tailor and inventor, Franz became hyper-fixated on developing a sort of wearable parachute. He had identified a gap in the market with the rise of humanity's newest invention, the powered aircraft. Seeing reports of pilots forced to launch themselves out of their airborne contraptions if things went south, Franz vowed to come up with a solution to save lives. So he got to work in 1910 with some initial designs, testing the prototypes by strapping them onto makeshift dummies and hucking them off of a 5-story ledge. Surprisingly, the dummies managed to hit the ground at less than fatal speeds. Not bad. But there was a problem. The prototype weighed 150 pounds. And no pilot's gonna lug all that extra weight onto an aircraft, even if it would potentially save their life. But Franz would not give up. After all, you have to fail many times before you succeed. But it did help that there was also some monetary encouragement. Turns out that France's Aeronautic Club held a parachute-esque design competition which offered a cash prize to the tune of 10,000 francs. Considering that the average wage of an unskilled French laborer at the time was only a few francs a day, that prize was nothing to sneeze at. Over the next year, Reichelt was unable to replicate his initial success with any of the lighter redesigns. But to his logic, it wasn't a design problem, it was a height problem. Anyone who has even taken a basic physics course knows that this is a bad idea. You fall exponentially faster the longer you're airborne thanks to acceleration due to gravity. But what's a bunch of stupid science shit gonna do to stop an avid inventor from fulfilling his dream and lining his pockets? Nothing. But the pavement will. But Franz, determined to test his designs from a higher height, pleaded with the Parisian prefecture of police to allow him to run an experiment from the Eiffel Tower. Despite numerous rejections, they eventually gave in. On the bitter cold morning of February 4th, 1912, and to the surprise of everyone, Franz arrived on site in his dumpy-looking parachute suit. Now, the police only gave Franz permission to perform this stunt on the grounds that dummies would be used, not that he would be doing the jumping himself. This guy was so confident in his invention, boasting to news journalists of how successful it was gonna be. But apparently the police didn't feel like stopping him, so after a bunch of preparations, Reichelt made the leap, but his parachute suit failed to properly deploy, so the poor fella plummeted 187 feet to his death, achieving nothing but a Franz-shaped dent in the cement.
Deadliest chemical weapons.
Humans have been wiping each other from existence since the beginning of time. Whether it's a simple squabble or an alls-out, balls-out war, nothing is ever really resolved until at least one side lies in ruin. Spartans? Destroyed. The Romans? Vandalized. The Korean War? Forget about it. While a classic sword to the chest or a freedom seat to the old gray matter is perfectly capable of getting your point across, sometimes nations invest in more creative solutions. And that's where full-on chemical warfare comes in. You see, a quick and easy demise is a courtesy. It's the slow and agonizing expirations that really send a message. So let's see just how far humanity is strayed from the light, shall we? As a warning, you'll be seeing some gruesome images of the effects of these very real and very deadly chemicals. So if you're one to be watching these videos with a big old plate of food, you're in for a bad time. Anyway, first up is mustard gas. A bit more tangy than your average condiment, mustard gas was a game changer in World War I, which was already a game changer itself in the world of warfare. First used by the Germans during the Third Battle of Ypres in Belgium in the summer of 1917, mustard gas is one of the most well-known chemical weapons used during the Great War. But here's a fact for you: mustard gas isn't a gas. It's not even a mustard. It's actually a liquid at room temperature, which actually made it more effective in warfare. The thick and oily liquid would stick to most surfaces for days on end. And to take advantage of this, mustard gas was packed into artillery shells, which bombarded the battlefield. The artillery explosions would turn the liquid into a fine mist, spraying all over the place. What's worse is that the lethal liquid would slowly vaporize in warmer temperatures, creating creeping death clouds which would engulf engulf soldiers. This vicious vapor had a strong garlic or mustardy odor, which is how the chemical got its namesake. But no matter if it's a gas or a liquid, the horrible effects still remain the same. And I hope you're ready for some brief chemistry lessons here, because I'm going to be giving you a rundown of how these chemicals affect the human body. And since I'm a chemical engineer during my day job, you can, trust me, bro. Alright, so mustard gas is what's called a blistering agent. This means that its main form of attack is damaging human tissue. And this is done through the chemical's ability to really fudge up the DNA and proteins in the nuclei of your cells, particularly in the moisture areas of your body like your eyes, your skin, and your respiratory tract. So rest easy knowing that nowhere's really safe, especially if you sweat a lot, like say a soldier in the heat of battle carrying a crap ton of equipment. Any skin exposed to mustard gas will develop severe chemical burns, and thanks to all that DNA and protein destruction, will form very juicy but agonizingly painful yellow blisters, or as I like to call them, the forbidden Capri Suns. Now, with how bad this stuff is on your skin, it's even worse when it gets in your slippery wet eyeballs. If mustard gas gets in your eyes, you're gonna be hit with severe and immediate irritation, burning, and in some cases, partial or complete blindness. But that's just the effects on the outside of the body. Breathing the stuff in results in immediate burning and pain in your throat and nasal passages.
Why is it spicy?
Over the course of a few days, this will evolve into inflammation of said airways, causing restricted breathing, congestion, and likely complete respiratory failure. Those who did survive mustard gas exposure often suffered long-term respiratory complications for years after the war. Despite causing these horrific side effects and being the most commonly used chemical in old WW1, the mortality rate of mustard gas is pretty low, only making up about 2 to 3% of all chemical warfare deaths during the Great War. There was a chemical that was much more deadly than mustard gas, and that chemical is way back in 1812, Cornish chemist and long neck haver John Davy decided to try to make some new chemical compounds, as chemists tend to do. Today's attempt was exposing a mixture of carbon monoxide and chlorine gas to sunlight. UV radiation from the sunlight actually kicked off a reaction, forming a new gaseous compound. Davy named this creation phosgene, which, when roughly translated from Greek, means born from light. This compound was pretty easy to produce and was deemed valuable in various chemical synthesis reactions. It's even still used today as an intermediate chemical by industries for making stuff like plastics, insulation, and even pharmaceuticals. The problem though is that it's extremely deadly if misused. Easy to make and deadly when misused. Sounds like the perfect candidate for a chemical weapon, said the Germans in a silly and aggressive accent. And that's just what they did. In December of 1915, during the First Battle of Ypres, poor Belgium really can't catch a break, Germans set up about 3,000 cylinders of compressed phosgene gas on the front line. It was then released in a light breeze, causing a deadly white cloud which devoured the opposing forces. Now, phosgene is classified as a choking agent, which, although very kinky, is lethal. When exposed to phosgene gas, you immediately experience violent coughing, difficulty breathing because, a choking agent, and nausea and vomiting. Not only will your skin develop painful chemical burns, but your respiratory tract as well. Just like with chlorine gas that I mentioned in a previous video, phosgene has a similar mechanism of action. It reacts with residual moisture inside and outside of your body through a process called hydrolysis, which forms hydrochloric acid and carbon dioxide. The newly formed acid eats away at any tissue it comes in contact with, which hurts, like a lot. The gas also directly damages your body's cells, causing your blood vessels to start leaking out fluids to neighboring organs, particularly your lungs, which is, as the French say, no bueno. The excess fluid in your lungs only makes your breathing worse and worse until eventually you're physically unable to breathe and you suffocate. Now, you might be familiar with the fact that a key tactic of World War I was trench warfare. Both sides of the war dug miles and miles of trenches as a way to protect themselves from machine gun fire. It's really hard to shoot at guys when they're in a little hidey hole. Well, this is where chemical weapons really shined. You see, chemicals like mustard gas and phosgene are much heavier than air, which means that the gases would creep over the land and pour into the trenches, flushing out any soldiers who happen to be in the wrong place, the wrong time. Warfare involving chemical weapons was horrifying. British officer Martin Greener recounted witnessing a cloud of poison gas approaching his position.
Just at dawn, they opened a very heavy fire, especially machine gun fire. And that's the idea, was that apparently to make you get down. And then the next thing we heard this sizzling, you know. I mean, you could hear this damn stuff coming out. And then saw this awful cloud coming over. Great yellow, greenish yellow cloud. Wasn't very high, about, I would say, it wasn't more than 20 feet up. Nobody knew what to think. But immediately it got there, we knew what to think. I mean, you knew what it was. Well, then of course you immediately began to choke. Then the word came, whatever you do, don't go down. You see, if you got to the bottom of the trench, you got the full blast of it, because it was heavy stuff, it went down.
Now, you have to remember that phosgene was first used in 1915. The first effective gas masks weren't developed or distributed for a few months, meaning that these first witnesses had little to no protection against this stuff. In the end, phosgene is estimated to be the cause of over 90,000, or about 85% of all known chemical weapon deaths during World War I. Although history likes to highlight the German Empire for their aggressive use of chemical weapons during the Great War, and rightfully so, it was actually France who first used tear gas in 1914. But compared to chemicals like phosgene, it's like hucking a paper ball at a cannon. Just prior to World War I's big spankin' sequel, Germany was experiencing a bit of a problem outside of planning world domination. Bugs. A bunch of weird little weevils were doing irreparable damage to German orchards, which were a key food source. You see, you have to be a little self-sustaining when you inevitably piss off the rest of the world. In response, German scientists were tasked with developing an effective insecticide to wither the weevils. In 1938, one Gerhard Schrader mixed phosphorus with cyanide, developing a toxic compound that was too deadly for agricultural use. If you can't kill bugs with it, maybe you can kill enemy troops with it. This compound was dubbed taboon, from the German word for taboo, because the compound was deemed too deadly for use. But that didn't dissuade Schrader, who rushed back to the lab to perform more experiments, and in doing so, he quickly developed a much more potent version of the already lethal compound. And this new poison was called sarin, a very volatile, odorless, colorless liquid. Why is it so deadly? Well, sarin is classified as a nerve agent, arguably the deadliest and most horrifying classification of any chemical weapon. And it works like this. Now really turn your brains on for this explanation. In your body is your nervous system. This is basically the entire body's communication network, controlling your movements, your thoughts, your emotions, your memory, muscle function, and passive functions like your heartbeat and your breathing. Well, sarin comes in and fucks all that up by messing with these guys. These are neurotransmitters, chemical compounds that are passed between neurons in your nervous system. Some neurotransmitters you may be familiar with are adrenaline, which gives you that fight or flight feeling, serotonin, the happiness molecule, and dopamine, which hits really hard when you're up about 450% on your spy calls, but you're too stupid to sell them even though they expire in 2 hours. Well, I would like you to meet acetylcholine. This neurotransmitter is what controls your muscle movement, your thought process, and your learning ability. When passed from your nervous system to your muscles are stimulated and move the way your brain tells them to. After your muscles are done doing what they're doing, the acetylcholine is then broken down by acetylcholinesterase, allowing the muscles to relax. So sarin over here comes in and breaks that communication line. Your muscles are bombarded with signals to move, but no signals to stop. As a result, victims who are exposed to sarin gas are no longer in control of their own bodies. They can't think, they can't breathe. The body continues to seize and painfully convulse. This complete loss of bodily function means death is quick, in as little as a single minute with direct inhalation. Compared to phosgene, sarin is calculated to be about 43 times more lethal when comparing lethal dosages. The sheer potential destruction of the chemical was enough to prevent Germany from ever using the gas during World War II. Some sources claim that the main mustache in charge was too scared to unleash it after his own personal experiences with mustard gas in World War I. But the guy authorized using gas chambers on innocent civilians, so I'm calling bullshit on that one. Regardless of the reason, sarin was never authorized for use in World War II. However, sarin, along with a beefed up version called cyclosarin, are known to have been used by Iraq in 1983 during the Iran-Iraq War, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. An even deadlier version of the nerve agent called soman was also synthesized, but luckily it's never been used. Together, taboon, sarin, soman, and cyclosarin make up the G series of nerve agents. And you can pause here to read up on them. Alright, we need a mental health break here, so let's get some of that serotonin rebalanced. Oh, look at this little guy. He's living it up, he's doing his thing. He's got a piece of fluff, he's probably gonna nope, he ate it. Alright. Ugh, now look at this handsome little man. I think I know what he wants you to do. That's right. Don't disappoint him. Alright, back to the devastation and despair. Venomous Agent X, or VX for short, is a chemical compound discovered by the British in the 1950s, while, go figure, researching potential pesticides. Oh, how the turntables. Britain pulled the whole copy my homework but in your own words move by building off of the aforementioned Gerard Schrader's work. Once fully developed and refined, the compound was then produced for the sake of chemical warfare, should the world wars decide to become a trilogy. In its pure form, VX is a thick, oily, amber-colored liquid that is relatively non-volatile, meaning that it doesn't vaporize easily on its own at room temperature. These physical properties prevent the oil-like chemical from dissipating wherever it's released. It can remain on the ground and plants for days on end, creating poison pools across the landscape. The odorless and tasteless liquid is lethal in very small doses. Just a few milligrams on your skin will be enough to send you vertically packing. The mechanism of action is identical to sarin, causing a complete loss of bodily function and death by asphyxiation. However, VX is considered to be much more potent. In 1993, the United Nations banned, along with several other chemical weapons, the production and stockpiling of VX in any amount that exceeds 100 grams, or about a quarter pound minus the cheese. VX had also been used alongside sarin during the Iran-Iraq War in 1983. As well as a few assassinations, the most high profile of which being the brother of North Korea leader guy Kim Jong-un in 2017, where two women rubbed a cloth soaked with the nerve agent in the poor guy's face at an airport. He received his one-way boarding pass to the Northeast Korea in the sky in just 15 minutes. But that's not the end of nerve agents just yet. No, now it's the Soviet Union's turn to dabble in chemical weapons in the 1970s. Many sneaky Soviet scientists were tasked with developing new nerve agents to bypass the UN's banned chemical weapons list. After over 2 decades of research, the Novichok series of nerve agents were developed. These 8 compounds are believed to be the most toxic things ever developed by mankind, besides political subreddits. Now, the Novichok agents are functionally equivalent to other nerve agents, but again, are much more potent than the last. Although weapons were created to release these agents, they were never deployed on the battlefield. Instead, these compounds are mainly used in silencing enemies of the state, with one of the most recent cases being in 2018. If you've actually paid attention in any of your world history classes, then you know what this stuff is. Zyklon B. Derived from the German word for cyclone, this pesticide turned humanicide was developed by, you guessed it, those gosh dang Germans back in the 1920s. Originally for much more innocent uses like getting rid of lice on clothes, to fumigating warehouses, ships, and even trains used to transport cattle. Just cattle. Zyklon B's main ingredient is hydrogen cyanide, a toxic systemic poison. The compound takes the form of small pellets which, when exposed to air, evaporate into a gas. Now before some nerds out there correct me, the phase change from a solid directly to a vapor is actually called sublimation. This is me saying, I know. What matters is the impact of the gas once inhaled. The biology of it all is very complex, but basically when a victim inhales hydrogen cyanide, it's absorbed into the blood through the lungs, where it breaks down into regular cyanide. This then poisons the body's cells, particularly the mitochondria. You know, the powerhouse of the cell. Aren't you glad you learned that one? Well, inside the mitochondria, cyanide stops the cellular respiration process. This means that your body can no longer produce the energy required for your cells to do their jobs. And just like in this American economy, without jobs, the cells die very quickly. As a result, the entire body shuts down, with death occurring within minutes of exposure. Of course, you may know that Zyklon B was Adolf Hitler's poison of choice to systematically eliminate millions in a bout of weaponized ostracism. You know, during that big historical event in World War II that YouTube doesn't like people talking about. Isn't it great living in a time where we have to censor ourselves when discussing horrific historical events? Anyway, next chapter. During the Vietnam War from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, the US was kind of getting their asses handed to them. One of the main problems for US troops was North Vietnam's territorial advantage. Thick foliage and treacherous jungles provided the northern military with tactical cover and vantage points. So how do you fight back against a hidden opponent? You take away their hiding spots. And that's exactly what the US tried to do when they developed the Rainbow Agents, toxic herbicides developed specifically for converting a lush jungle biome into a complete wasteland. Luckily, a bunch of US chemical companies already produced herbicides for use in agriculture to kill off invasive plants that threaten crop yields. The most notable companies were the Dow Chemical Company and the Monsanto Company. These companies were then tasked with upping production for the war effort. In all, 6 herbicides were developed: Agents Green, Pink, Purple, Blue, White, and Orange, all named after the color-coded barrels that they were shipped in. Agent Orange was released into the environment by any means necessary. Helicopters, planes, boats, trucks, backpacks, whatever could be used to spray liquid everywhere. It's estimated that over 11 million gallons of Agent Orange showered over South Vietnam, as well as the neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. The US government actually sprayed about 20 times more than what the chemical manufacturers deemed necessary to get the job done.
You what?
Tens of thousands of square miles of rainforest and jungle were devastated in the 60s and 70s. Full ecosystems were flat out destroyed. Surviving wildlife were forced to relocate, and while not directly intended, hundreds of thousands of people were caught in the crossfire, soldiers and civilians alike. Immediate exposure symptoms included skin irritation and swelling, as well as difficulty breathing. Overall, the short-term effects were pretty mild and non-threatening. However, it was the long-term effects that packed the punch. In all, 14 diseases are linked with Agent Orange exposure, including various cancers, Parkinson's disease, and severe birth defects thanks to the chemical mixture's genetically damaging mechanism of action. Despite not being solely intended as a chemical weapon against humans, it is estimated that over 300,000 US troops and over 400,000 Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian people have died as a result of Agent Orange's long-term side effects, making the compound one of the deadliest in history. Evil people you've never heard of. They say that if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. A quote that perfectly describes Vasily Blokhin, the deadliest executioner in known human history. Blokhin got his first taste for blood after joining the Red Army during the events of World War I. Over the years, he became the perfect soldier. One who is able to perform tasks effectively, efficiently, and without hesitation. This of course really accelerated Blokhin's military career, as in 1921 he was recruited into the Soviet secret police organization known as the NKVD. One bonus on his extensive resume was his innate ability to remain emotionally numb when carrying out acts of violence. He simply saw it as part of the job, comparative to menial tasks like filing paperwork or having to put up with Deborah from HR's incessant complaints that your funny shirt just isn't work appropriate. Blokhin's unique skill, if you would call it that, quickly distinguished him amongst his peers. If you needed someone dead, Vasily was your guy. His work and unwavering loyalty continued to push him upward and onward. In just 6 years, he was assigned as head of a newly created branch of the NKVD by Mr. Supreme Soviet leader guy Joseph Stalin, a branch specifically designed for executions. And with that, Blokhin had become one of Stalin's most trusted workers, executing low and high-profile targets without question.
Excellent work, Blokhin. That goes right up on fridge.
During his service, Blokhin had personally executed thousands of people, including high-ranking Soviet officials during the Great Purge, an internal mass execution of anyone remotely accused of opposing Stalin's rule. Blokhin himself had been spared from the purge due to his repeated proofs of loyalty to the Soviet cause, his magnum opus being his involvement in the Katyn massacre. Now, if you've never heard of the Katyn Massacre, I wouldn't be surprised. When teaching about World War II, history classes tend to focus on German war atrocities and kind of skim over all of the other ones, especially the Soviet Union's. Despite the German invasion of Poland in 1939 and World War II officially starting, the Allied powers of Great Britain and France didn't really do much in retaliation.
Oi, Germany, you better leave Poland alone.
Oh, fair point, carry on. The big bad Soviet Union had also invaded Poland just a few weeks later, capturing hundreds of thousands of Polish prisoners of war, many of which were sent to labor camps. But in the spring of 1940, around 22,000 prisoners consisting of Polish officers, engineers, teachers, and other civilians were systematically executed under Blokhin's supervision, with Blokhin himself having personally executed over 7,000 people in just 28 days. Now think about that for a second. 7,000 people in 28 days. That's 250 people a day. Now, Blokhin and his men reportedly would work 10-hour days non-stop, so that's 25 people an hour, or one person every 2 to 3 minutes. Now, these weren't indirectly through ordering his men, but this was by his own hand. Blokhin had pretty much developed an assembly line of death so efficient it would make Henry Ford envious. Prisoners would be escorted into a soundproofed room against a sandbag-lined wall. Without a word, these prisoners' last sensation would be feeling the muzzle of a German pistol in the back of their neck before being brutally murdered. Wait, a German pistol? I hear you ask. Why would Soviets be using German pistols? 2 words: plausible deniability. Think of it this way: if thousands of victims in mass graves happen to be found with German bullets lodged in their noggins, who do you think's gonna be blamed? Don't look at us, it was them. Blokhin's massacre is regarded as the largest mass murder conducted by a single person in known human history, even acknowledged by the coveted Guinness Book of World Records in 2010. Really stretching for content there. It is believed that throughout his career, Blokhin's personal kill count had reached tens of thousands, but his spree would soon come to an end. After Stalin privately passed away in a puddle of piss in 1953, Blokhin was forced into retirement in disgrace. He was ostracized by the public and stripped of his military honors during the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. So, of course, he did what any Russian does when they're sad or happy or breathing. He consumed a lot of alcohol, a habit that eventually led to his death in 1955 at the age of 60. Right after the thrilling events of World War I in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed. With a little bit of elbow grease and the mashing together of various kingdoms and regions, a new political entity was formed. The state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, home to many Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. One of those kingdoms thrown in the mix was Croatia, the birthplace of this stern jug of juice, Ante Pavelić. His main personality trait was loving Croatia. God, he loved Croatia. So much so that he made a name for himself and rose through the ranks as a politician and representative in state parliament in order to demand Croatian independence. But this guy, Alexander I, had other ideas. Who's he? Well, he's the Prince Regent in these parts and the one who just got done unifying all of these kingdoms and states. Years and years of political turmoil ensued, which is honestly to be expected when you force a bunch of different political regions together into singularity. In 1929, now King Alexander had hit a boiling point. In order to regain order, he dismantled and banned all political parties, declaring a royal dictatorship. He even came up with a new name for his kingdom: Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia. But since Yugoslavia is not Croatia, Pavelić had it. He fled the kingdom and conspired with revolutionary groups to undermine the rule of Yugoslavia, who responded, "Do you want a death sentence? 'Cause that's how you get a death sentence." And so Pavelić got a death sentence. He was exiled to Germany, but since he didn't feel like dying quite yet, he instead skedaddled off to seek asylum in Italy. There, he used his political influence and persuasive stern look to form the Ustasha, a Croatian nationalist movement aimed at achieving Croatian independence by any means necessary. And you can bet your fat tits that means bombings, assassinations, and uprisings. During said uprisings, King Alexander regrettably stated, "If you want a regime change, you need to kill me." They did. On October 9th, 1934, King Alexander I was assassinated by Ustasha member Vlado Chernozemski, using a handgun hidden in a bouquet of flowers. Still living in Italy, Pavlich, along with several accomplices, were determined to be culpable for the assassination and were sentenced to death by Yugoslavia's friend France, who pressured Italy to carry out the deed. And Italy was all, "Linguini fettuccini, we ask a Mussolini." Thanks to his political privileges, Pavlich was only put under house arrest for 18 months. That'll teach him. Right, France? Oh, here we go. Looks like Germany's back at it again, and the world collectively Versailles in disappointment. After the invasion of France in 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941. This ultimately resulted in Pavlich being installed as dictator to a newly independent Croatia. The mean mustache himself even met with Pavlich and gave some pointers in the art of ethnic cleansing. The only art he ever saw any success in. But Pavlich would soon put this advice into action. During World War II, Pavlich had created his own network of concentration camps run by his beloved Ustasha, one of which being the Sisak concentration camp, the only known camp specifically designed for children. These camps carried out the collection and mass murder of nearly 400,000 Serbs, Jews, and Romani, with an additional 300,000 either exiled or forcibly converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, all for the sake of Croatian ethnic homogeneity. Towns were completely ransacked, villages were outright destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of innocent lives were lost. These actions gave the Ustasha notoriety that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who dared cross their path. Nazi Army General Edmund Gleisa-Hochtenau witnessed firsthand the atrocity of Pavlich and the Ustasha, saying, quote, "Our troops have to be mute witnesses of such events. It does not reflect well on their otherwise high reputation. The Ustasha have gone raging mad." That's pretty telling when even a Nazi general thinks you're being a bad dude. After the Axis powers fell, Pavlich got the hell out of Dodge, eventually fleeing to Argentina in 1948, but then some other surviving Ustasha members arrived. After a quick reunion of high fives and smooches, the gang wasted no time in forming the Croatian Liberation Movement. Persistent little buggers, weren't they? They were basically trying to control this from over here. It didn't work. After an assassination attempt in 1957, Pavlich hightailed it out of Argentina, eventually ending up in Spain, where he died of his injuries 2 years later. This is Idi Amin, regarded as one of the cruelest dictators in Ugandan history. He had humble beginnings back in 1946, where he served in the colonial army as a cook's assistant. In addition to cooking up a good steak, Amin was raring to have a job well done in his military career, so he speed ran through promotions within the Ugandan army, making it all the way up to captain in 1962.
I'm the captain now.
All of this impressive progress received recognition from Ugandan Prime Minister Milton Obote, and a friendship formed. Hey. Hi. One that would be fruitful in many shady activities, including ivory and gold smuggling. After being threatened with investigation by the Ugandan parliament, Obote overthrew King President Person Mutesa II and seized the position for himself in 1966. The ex-king was exiled to the UK, where he lamented over the loss of his country, ultimately drinking himself to death just 3 years later.
Poor little guy.
After the coup, Obote promoted a now more rotund Amin to commander of the Ugandan army, but all good times must come to an end. Obote himself was a terrible ruler. His regime was plagued with corruption and terror, resulting in nationwide starvation and cruelties toward the Ugandan people. Not surprisingly, Obote had experienced a failed assassination attempt where he was shot through the teeth and out his cheek. The assassin missed, and Obote is pissed, so in response he had any and all political parties banned, with their members jailed for life. Meanwhile, Amin was in the corner doing his own thing, building up his beloved military for less than necessary fighting in neighboring wars. Obote didn't like that, and Amin didn't like that Obote didn't like that, so they began not liking each other. As a personal bitch slap, Obote had stripped Amin of his freshly granted commanding privileges and threatened him with jail time for misappropriating military funds. But this only activated Amin's trap card, prompting a takeover of the Ugandan government while Obote was out and about doing president things. The Ugandan people, having just gone through years of suffering under Obote's regime, were pretty thrilled and cheered Amin's efforts. Woo. Now in control in 1971, Amin declared that the military would temporarily run the government until new elections could be run. He even promised to free all political prisoners. but he never did. In reality, he flew too close to the sun, taking comfort in its warmth. Just a week later, Amin declared himself President of Uganda, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Ugandan Army Chief of Staff, and Chief of Air Staff. The ego's starting to take over a bit. With this uncontested power, Amin began systematic executions of anyone who, he believed, would oppose his rule. Roughly 15,000 civilians had disappeared, now believed to have been kidnapped and given front row tickets to Amin's newly constructed state-of-the-art torture facility. However, this failed to slake Amin's thirst for blood. He soon expanded his list of victims to various groups throughout the country. We're talking artists, journalists, lawyers, students, senior members of government, foreign nationals, anyone who had even the most infinitesimally small tie to Obote. There were even rumors of Amin being a cannibal, or at least having tasted human meat, though it seems like he rated it 1 star as it was, quote, too salty for him. Human rights organizations estimate that between 300,000 to 500,000 people were slain under Amin's tyrannical rule. Known as the Butcher of Africa, Idi Amin not only murdered his own people, but devastated the Ugandan economy as well. He had expelled around 80,000 business owners and seized their property. So Amin walked up to an African stand and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bump, bump, bump.
Get out of here or I'll kill you."
Then he waddled away, waddle waddle. These businesses, which were basically the country's economic backbone, were handed off to his inner circle, and they all quickly went bankrupt from mismanagement. Edie? More like idiot. Anyway. The businesses accounted for about 90% of the government's tax revenue, so government funds went poof. Yeah, just like that. Amin became blinded with power, so much so that he was unable to see the inevitable brick wall that the country was heading towards. His closest cabinet members, realizing that murdering everyone and crippling an economy aren't really the best long-term policies, started to defect, abandoning Uganda to seek safety elsewhere. Amin even began losing control over his own military. Coups and mutinies were commonplace as officers fought for power. But he had a plan. I have a plan. We're gonna take Tanzania. Alley-oop.
He's just not as funny as oversimplified.
Uh-oh. Tanzania fought back. Hard. In order to save face, the former 10-time Ugandan light heavyweight champion Amin had a plan. I have a plan. Yeah, Amin actually suggested a boots-to-asses 1v1 super slam. But the Tanzanian president had a plan of his own. In the end, Amin was deposed and fled in exile, where he apparently ate up to 40 oranges a day until his death in 2003. Our last stop is definitely no picnic. Now, if this video wasn't satisfying enough, I do have more of these little evil bastards for another video, so if you want me to make it, let me know in the comments. While you're at it, let me know who you would want me to cover. For our last entry, we'll be taking a trip down to Colombia. Now, any of you Colombians out there might be familiar with this guy, but for those of us who don't put cheese in our hot chocolate, let me introduce you to Luis Garavito, perhaps one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. This guy was a straight-up monster. Appropriately nicknamed La Bestia, or The Beast, Garavito was arrested in 1999 and convicted of murdering 193 children. Garavito's crimes began when he was just 15 in 1972. He had reportedly suffered severe depression, psychosis, and paranoia, allegedly stemming from an extremely abusive and traumatic childhood at the hand of his father. Pairing all that mental anguish with crippling alcoholism and an aggressive personality, Garavito began compulsively forcing himself on young children. Disgusted by his own actions, he had attempted to seek help, attending church sermons, AA meetings, and even seeing psychiatrists, wanting nothing more than to live a normal, happy life. But he was never able to claw himself out of the dark hole that he was in. Look, there's no denying that childhood trauma is tragic, but when you commit unspeakable acts of violence against innocent children, or really anyone for that matter, sympathy kinda goes out the window. Being a victim's one thing, creating victims is another. Moving into the 80s, Garavito's habits had only escalated. He emphasized that his urges to act out were constant and, according to him, uncontrollable. He would impulsively assault homeless children, and to make matters worse, began carrying razor blades and lighters to satiate his growing lust for violence. After each outburst and eventually regaining his composure, Garavito claimed that he would be overwhelmed with guilt. He would write down the names of his victims in a notebook and pray for their safety. At this point, his victim count had crossed above 100. Devastated by his supposedly uncontrollable impulses, he desperately tried to find any answers as to why he was the way he was. He looked to religion, astrology, the occult, really anything that could potentially bring him some revelation. But during this little literary leap, he had stumbled upon a certain notorious autobiography. With each turn of the page, Garavito really started relating to this Adolf guy. I mean, they both suffered abusive childhoods, lived in poverty, are both complete dickholes, you know, that kind of stuff. Luis even went a bit further and began idolizing one Campo Delgado, a Colombian serial killer who had publicly murdered 28 people, including his own mother, in the 1980s. More specifically, he admired the national attention that Delgado received and wanted to experience that firsthand. Now, the 1990s is where Garavito really went off the rails. He was now apathetic in his crimes. He felt nothing. No remorse, no sorrow, nothing. With all emotional ties cut, Garavito's actions hit an apex. Across this decade, Luis committed the mass murder and assault of hundreds of children. In disguise, he lured victims into secluded areas in broad daylight where they were assaulted, stabbed, cut, burned, beaten, eviscerated, and dismembered. After their passing, the victims were often placed in dozens of mass graves scattered across the countryside, with some containing as many as 40 bodies. Now, you can't really hide violence of that caliber for long, so eventually the graves were discovered in 1998 and an official investigation was launched. Because of his continued alcoholism, Garavito's work was sloppy. He would often leave articles of clothing, empty liquor bottles, and various belongings at his crime scenes. Honestly, it's kind of weird that it took so long to get caught, but the mountains of evidence did eventually lead to his arrest in 1999. While being interrogated, Garavito confessed to the murder of hundreds of children. Now, of course, in order to prevent the large, sandpapery, unlubed fist of YouTube from giving my butthole an identical neighbor, I of course cannot go into the nitty-gritty of the crimes. You morbidly curious little deviants would have to look that up for yourselves. But don't say I didn't warn you. In the end, Garavito's crimes rightfully warranted a sentence of up to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. That's pretty great. Except for the fact that Colombian law at the time prevented any sentence from being longer than 40 years. And get this, since he had given a full confession and even helped investigators find the bodies, his sentence was further reduced down to just 22 years, and the Colombian population was pissed. But luckily, in 2021, Garavito's parole was personally denied by the Colombian president, who vowed that he would never be a free man again. And he never was. Luis Garavito was diagnosed with eye cancer and died in prison in 2023.
Embarrassing royal deaths. At just 6 years old, itty-bitty Jimmy II of Scotland was an excited little prince eager to one day inherit the throne from his dear old dad, King James I. And it looks like that day is today.
Dad?
James I was a victim of a coup conducted by his power-hungry uncle who sought to seize the throne. His wife, the Queen, was injured but managed to survive despite being an intended target. Although certainly shaken, she stirred up quite the outcry from her Scottish subjects by putting her now very dead husband's corpse on display, and seeing the sheer brutality that had occurred, an all-out manhunt began for the men responsible. And these men were captured and brutally executed. With the old king gone, it was time to crown a new one. Being only 6 at the time of his dad's dastardly demise, Slimmy Jimmy Jr. was crowned on March 27, 1437. But since he couldn't make any sound decisions as a drooling youth, his still-alive mom took power as regent, acting as ruler on James's behalf. But therein lies the problem. See, the people of Scotland are what we call Scottish. The Queen, now ruling over Scotland, hailed from England. You see the problem here. She was promptly pushed from power in favor of someone a bit more Scottish.
Bursting through the door is Archibald Douglas.
He's the king's much older first cousin. He took the job but died a few years later from a fever since there wasn't a cowbell in sight. Power was then passed to these two fine fellows, Lord William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston. Their goal was to keep King James safe and in power,
But in such a hostile political environment, with all of these seemingly random people trying to do their best to position themselves into more power, sometimes it takes a bit of violence to achieve those goals. The best example of said violence being the infamous Black Dinner. In 1440, Lord Crichton and Sir Livingston held a royal dinner at Edinburgh Castle, where the king resided. At the top of the invite list were 16-year-old William Douglas and his 10-year-old brother, David Douglas. They were the sons of former fever-haver Archibald Douglas and a threat to the crown. While downing a hock of ham and a bushel of apples, or whatever they ate in those times, the brothers would soon learn that this dinner would come with a show. In the middle of the meal, a decapitated black bull's head was aggressively slammed onto the table in front of them. Ooh, dessert. Now, apparently having a black bull's bulbous block brutally bashed onto your beautiful buffet was a Scottish nobleman's friendly gesture of impending doom. Despite the young King James's pleas, the two boys were captured and beheaded right in front of him. Hardly appetizing. This historical power move was the direct inspiration for that red wedding scene in the Game of Thrones. Fast forward through a few years of childhood trauma to 1449, and the now 19-year-old James marries a nice lady named Mary, and she shoots out 7 kids. One of them dies. Very sad, but very typical. With his marriage and coming of age, James's kingship switched from free trial to premium access. However, what was left of those dang Douglases are still fighting to retain power. If only there was a way for a king to take care of such an annoyance. Yeah, that works. James eventually wiped the Douglases from power and yoinked their land, and he was now in full control of his kingdom. Despite looking super spooky with his villainous vermilion birthmark covering half of his face like that one Avatar guy, I don't know his name, I never watched it, James was a very successful king. He was super social with commoners and advocated for advances in education, helping found the University of Glasgow in 1451. James was also a huge proponent of modern war technology, which, at the time, happened to be war cannons. These engineering marvels of bronze and iron were critical in besieging forts and castles, as cannonballs would just chew right through them things. While attempting to capture Roxburgh Castle, one of the last Scottish castles still under smelly English control after the Scottish Independence Wars, King James II positioned himself next to one of his prized cannons, and after a few words of encouragement to his bombardment buddy, the king gave the order. Artillery! The mounted metal menace exploded, killing King James II instantly at the age of 29. This rather unfortunate death was cemented in Scottish lore on August 3rd, 1460, and is officially, well, canon. In the middle of the Capetian dynasty, the Kingdom of France was ruled by this guy, Louis VI, also known as Louis the Fat, which is just mean. He should be called Louis the Body Positive. Anyway, this big fat asshole had 8 kids, and this chapter is all about his eldest son, Philip.
Call me Phil.
As was tradition in the Capetian dynasty to establish a clear lineage to the throne, young Philip was crowned as co-king of the Franks at the tender age of 13, right about the time when teen angst starts kicking in. Although reportedly Louis's favorite child, Philip was a bit of a stinker. He would refuse to listen to his father's authority, fail to pay attention to any of the king's lectures and set standards for being a king, and devolved into being a disobedient little shithead, as kids tend to be. According to Walter Mapp, a historic writer during that time period, the continued arrogance and insubordination of the spry little king made him, quote, a burden to all. You know, like when you see a small child convulsing on the floor of your local Target because a 36-year-old man-child snatched the last Pokemon Prismatic Evolutions booster pack out of their clammy little ham hands while the parent just looked on in a dead stare? Hang in there, man. Even though a troublesome youth, the problem would soon fix itself. In October of 1131, at age 15, young King Philip was chilling with the bros, racing through the streets on their 1-horsepower tricked-out Mustangs, when everything was turned on its head. A small sable swine scuttled into the street, right in the path of the oncoming prince and his gang. Philip, who was leading the group, was catapulted off of his horse after it had tripped over the surprise pig. Prince Philip slammed into the ground in a devastating crack and crunch of bone, fracturing all of his limbs and being rendered unconscious. Tragically, the young king had succumbed to his wounds the very next day. King Louis and his family were stricken with immense grief over the loss of their son. The little piggy went to market, but it should have stayed home. George II, King of Great Britain, began life as a tiny little bratwurst in Hanover, Germany in 1683. His father, also George, was the first king of the Hanoverian era and a rather combative parent. Neither George liked the other and would always get into very heated and very public arguments over stuff like politics and other king things. But to be a little more specific, Small George despised his dad's advisor, Robert Walpole, the guy considered to be the first British Prime Minister and the one who was really pulling all of the political strings behind the scenes. Think Wizard of Oz, but with a smaller head and worse teeth. But one day, enough was enough. Big George banished Little George from the king's palace after a falling out. The prince was pretty okay with this. He and his wife lived in peace and quiet for quite a few years until, well, the king died. Time to go be a king. Prince George achieved his kingship in 1727 at the age of 43. Views of his reign as king were mixed. Despite squashing political uprisings, expanding the arts, laying the foundations for the Industrial Revolution, and overseeing many successful military conflicts, including leading his troops into battle himself at the age of 60, his English subjects just couldn't get over the fact that he was German, so, they were biased. Growing into his golden years, age started to really take a toll on the king. By 1760, King George II was 76, blind in one eye and hard of hearing. In the wee hours of October 25th, the rather fermented monarch rose from his bed, drank his iconic 6 a.m. hot chocolate, and excused himself to the loo to force out his own hot chocolate. But it was here on his cushy secondary throne that things took a turn for the worse. A servant stationed outside of the royal chambers heard a loud crash and comedically tore the door open to find the root of the commotion. What he found was the king on the floor, seemingly having just finished his business. George was lifted onto his bed and tended to by his physician, but his body crapped out on him. The king was dead. An autopsy of the royal remains indicated that the king had died as a result of a thoracic aortic dissection, the first reported case in history. See that tear right there in the aorta, the big artery leading into his artery? Yeah, that's not supposed to be there, but how it happened is the question. And it is believed that the blood pressure required to cause such a rupture on an old man's already weakened heart came from a rather forceful push of the pelvic floor muscles. So, in an attempt to relieve himself of his intestinal burden, the king relieved himself of this mortal coil. Remember to stay hydrated. In a time where kings were given rather displeasing titles such as the Terrible or the Bad or the Slobberer, Martin of Aragon was granted the title of Martin the Humane. The gracious nickname was a testament to his kind and caring nature. He basically earned it by being a bit less murdery than any other kings at the time. I mean, all the guy did was reconquer Sardinia, suppress revolts, and led crusades against the Moors in northern Africa. But other than that, he was a perfect little angel, focusing on internal stability within his own kingdom of Aragon. But times of peace make for soft men. With little to no conflict to tend to in his later years, Martin grew older and wider. By 1410, at age 53, the king was rather rotund, wrinkled, and in a risky state of health, both physically and mentally. You see, his wife and his 4 children had died, leaving him all alone on his throne. He had married his distant and much younger cousin as a last-ditch effort to produce an heir, but with no success. The depressed and obese king had little more to live for, and would instead gorge himself in solitude. On one fateful night, the king had just downed a whole roasted goose by himself. Where does he put it all? If you've ever slammed down a large meal too quickly, you usually get some pretty bad indigestion, or as I like to call it, the ERP. Since this was the land before Tums, the king had to sleep off his discomfort. He lumbered up to his royal chambers and shimmied himself into his rather strong bed. To cheer himself up a bit, Martin clapped his greasy meat hooks together, summoning his court jester for some late night entertainment so he could hop aboard the train to Sleepytime Junction with a smile, even though he had no idea what a train even was. The jester apparently took his sweet time while being summoned, as he was asked about where he was the moment he entered the king's chambers. And this was when all hell broke loose.
What the heck took you so long?
Well, now hold on. I can't in good conscience let this play out with at least putting up a disclaimer. What you're about to hear is the joke that supposedly ended a nearly 300-year medieval dynasty. This is not for the faint of heart. You were warned. I was in the next vineyard, where I saw a young deer hanging by his tail from a tree, as if someone had so punished him for stealing figs. The king lost his absolute shit, reportedly slapping his belly in laughter for 3 hours straight, eventually falling out of his bed and collapsing on the ground where he lay dead from an apparent heart attack. With no heirs to assume the throne, the House of Barcelona, after ruling the crown of Aragon for 273 years, fell after the delivery of a single joke. Now, of course, historians debate if this story is even true, as some accounts have Martin dying of the plague, food poisoning, or complications from his weight, but those aren't nearly as funny. Archduke Alexander Leopold of Austria was a big dumb nerd. While the world of royalty focused on politics, land grabbing, and who could kill who more effectively, Alex instead played with his chemistry set in the corner, scribbling notes in a language called mathematics. It's no surprise that young Alex took a liking to the sciences, as his dad, Holy Roman Emperor Guy Leopold II, was a strong advocate for Enlightenment principles and the study of natural sciences.
Today's lesson is called gravity.
Whoa, gravity. But since he was still an emperor's son, involvement in politics was inevitable. Take, for instance, the Kingdom of Hungary. It wasn't officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was somehow still ruled by it. There were governors in charge, but Emperor Leopold was all,
Here's my son. Make him do something.
and thus little Alex was elected into a lordship position known as a palatine. He had a pretty good time in that position until the Jacobin conspiracy. A group of rebels were trying to have the Kingdom of Hungary break free from all Holy Roman Empire control, instead giving the royal crown to Alex. He very firmly said no, and the rebels were punished severely. With all of this political nonsense, Alex yearned for the simpler times of just mixing chemicals together to see what blows up. So in 1795, at the age of 22, Alex left Hungary for Vienna, Austria, and took up residence in Laxenburg Palace. Well, one summer, the young Archduke decided to turn up the heat and dabble in homemade pyrotechnics, a hobby that is famous for its safe and non-destructive nature. Expecting a visit from his cousin, Alex decided to rig up an extravagant fireworks display inside the palace.
Hey, just cause you're educated doesn't mean you're smart.
To be fair, he, along with a few servants, set up the show within a fortified armory called a casemate, with the intent of firing the rockets towards the outside. So it's not like he decided to just shove firecrackers into a kitchen cabinet for shits and gigs. He was a man of science after all. Nevertheless, all gunpowder and makeshift explosives were stored inside the fortified walls. When his cousin arrived, he attempted to fire off the first rocket, but since Mother Nature has great comedic timing, a rogue gust of wind blew the rocket over, launching itself into other explosives and gunpowder reserves. Everything exploded, engulfing the Archduke and his servants in a goodness gracious great ball of fire. Talk about going out with a bang, am I right? The title of king kinda just fell into the lap of old Adolf Frederick of Sweden in 1751. During the Age of Liberty, a time in history when the Swedish parliament was all... Adolf's rule as king was essentially worthless. He was no more than a political figurehead while all the real guys in fancy wigs did the ruling. But apparently not very well, because by the end of the Age of Liberty in 1772, Sweden was kind of worse for the wear. Its land ownership had diminished, trade had evaporated, and technological advancements were lagging. So Sweden was forced to sit back and watch its neighbors and rivals proudly wave around their large, throbbing economies. During King Adolf's lavishly lackadaisical leadership, nothing extraordinary happened.
The substandard sovereign did attempt to regain power, but failed to do so, because he sucked.
In fact, his entire reign is seen as a dull but peaceful lull in Swedish history with not much to show for it. And unfortunately for the king, the only exciting point in his life, at least from a historical perspective, was his death. According to some historical records, the rather indulgent king had overindulged himself on some food. On February 12, 1771, the king's last supper reportedly consisted of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Oh, and a few of these bad boys. This is a semla, a traditional Swedish sweet roll stuffed with almond paste and whipped cream, and hot damn does it look tasty. And that's exactly what the king thought as he inhaled 14 of them. Not surprisingly, all of that food did not sit well in the king's tummy, and all that internal stress is believed to have caused heart failure. The poor guy straight up ate himself to death. Now, before the actually crowd starts pounding away on their greasy keyboards, this tale of his death is regarded as propaganda and is highly discredited by modern historians. The official autopsy report for the king has survived all of these years and has concluded, based on all the evidence that they could gather from sleuthing around the king's insides, that his royal majesty had a stroke. Now, suffering from a stroke is rough, but for a king that wasn't up to par, it's a fair way to go. That's some golf humor for you.
The silliest deaths in history. Part 2. In a world of constant scientific revolution and innovation, it's required that any new theories be put to the test with reliable and repeatable proofs. Otherwise, you're about as useful as a flat earther. But sometimes that proof puts people in harm's way. Take, for instance, one Jesse William Lazier. This handsome block of cheddar was an American physician in the late 1800s, though he did live to see the new century, just not for very long, but we'll get to that in a bit. Growing from a well-to-do boy into a well-to-do man, Lazier had a passion for helping the ill and minimizing all of the icky sickies that had plagued humanity throughout history. So he took that passion and put it to good use, receiving his doctorate in medicine from Columbia University in 1892. Upgrading himself from graduate to practicing physician in 1895, Lazier focused his studies on two major diseases, the infectious malaria and the deadly yellow fever, both of which were stirring up all kinds of problems in the late 1800s, the worst of which being that people were dying. But exactly how these diseases were being spread so easily, particularly in the southern United States and in the Caribbean, remained a mystery, for a few more years at least. Well, that's not exactly true. You see, about 14 years earlier, Cuban public health professional disease research guy Carlos Finlay came up with a theory. He proposed that some diseases, particularly yellow fever, could be transmitted through the bite of a single infected mosquito. It's a rather simple theory. An itty-bitty mosquito bites an infected monkey, acquires the yellow fever, flies away, finds a healthy human, gives the suck and leaves behind yellow fever, and the cycle continues. Now, if you've ever spent more than 2 seconds in the American South, you know just how bad them little shits can get. So if there's a few infected people and a lot of mosquitoes, things are going to spread faster than a bad joke at a dad convention. Oh, come on, I'm hungry. He said it. Finlay laid out his research and presented his nido-mosquito theory to the scientific community, opting for control over the mosquito population to minimize the spread. And they all laughed at him. All them stupid science bitches ridiculed and mocked Finlay's theory, brushing it off as complete nonsense. But now we fast forward more than a decade, and a very confident Lazier was willing to put that theory to the test. On himself.
Right here's an infected skater, and here's an uninfected me. So, if it bites me and I get infected, well, there you go.
And so, in September of 1900, Lazier was deliberately bitten by an infected mosquito. He contracted yellow fever and died several days later. But his sacrifice would not be in vain, as it confirmed Finlay's theory, subsequently revolutionizing the control of yellow fever, including controlling the mosquito population. The age of exploration saw a lot of exploring from many a capable sea captain. But amongst the Columbuses and Marco Polos of history, some have fallen through the cracks, their deeds and accomplishments forgotten to time, or just not important enough for people to care. Johnny Kendrick was one such captain. Ever since growing up aboard Papa Kendrick's whaling vessel in his teenage years, John had a love of the sea, which explains the vast success he found in his later years. This guy was more American than a strapped apple pie asking for a tip. A member of the American Sons of Liberty, Kendrick personally took part in the famous Boston Tea Party, hucking countless crates of precious British life fuel into the harbor. He also commanded a privateer ship during the American Revolution, attacking and capturing British warships with his crew of 104 men, even going as far as helping convince the French to join the fight. After helping America get its independence, Kendrick took to the seas once more, this time on a more exploratory venture. Teaming up with famous explorer ship-sailing captain fellow Robert Gray, whom you've probably never heard of, the two bros made history, leading the first US expedition to the Pacific Northwest, where they established a strong fur trade route. This was mainly trading goods like mirrors and knives to purchase sea otter pelts from local natives. Hey, gotta do what you gotta do, you know? Kendrick also made himself at home in Hawaii in the late 1700s. There, he built up a pretty lucrative sandalwood trade hub, harvesting the wood in Hawaii and shipping it off to China, who treasured the luscious lumber for its durability, medicinal and therapeutic properties, and of course, its smell.
Oh, that's good wood.
So Kendrick spent many a year just jamming as much of his wood as he could into China's supple trading ports, skipping back and forth across the Pacific Pond between mainland China and the Hawaiian Islands. But Hawaii, historically speaking, often had a bunch of fighting between chiefs of the different islands. Each chief, understandably enough, wanted to expand their respective territories and influence. Well, when returning to the islands in 1794, Kendrick found Hawaii to be in complete turmoil, with two chiefs duking it out to be the big chief in charge. One of the tribes was being supplied by Captain William Brown, a proper Brit who was willing to get some land for the British crown. Kendrick replied he too supplied a chief of great renown, and put to the test Kendrick did his best to smack the captain down. So in December of 1794, a battle commenced with Captain Brown supporting the chief of Oahu and Kendrick supporting the chief of Kauai. How cute.
The tropical tussle ended with Kendrick's side being victorious, inspiring him to celebrate the only way a true American knows how, by firing off loud guns. As planned, Kendrick's ship had ignited a volley of cannon fire. Although his side had lost, Captain Brown, determined to uphold proper British etiquette, agreed to discharge a volley of his own cannons in Kendrick's honor.
Oh, this turtle soup is to die for.
Well, that's what you get for slurping your soup. Ugh, turns out in a complete honest mistake, Captain Brown forgot to unload shot from one of his cannons before firing it off. Some historical accounts claim that grape shot tore through Kendrick's cabin, creating complete chaos and quickly killing the competent captain as he crunched on a collation of consumables.
Oh, sorry about that. It's completely my fault.
Yep, that Jack Daniel, the two first-name having freak who founded the famous Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey Company. You know, that succulent spirit that did, will, or is getting you through those tough college days or life in general. That's the one. Well, little Jackie Boy was born in Tennessee in the mid-1800s as the youngest of 10, mainly because his birth was the one that sent his beloved mother skyward. Very sad. Now, unfortunately, not much is known about Jack's early life because them town records don't went caught fire. Most of the insight that we do have into Jack's life actually comes from the Jack Daniels Company historical records. Teeny Tiny Jack, the youthful entrepreneur that he was, yearned for work at the ripe old age of 8. The man to answer Jack's call was this guy, Dan Call, a preacher, a screecher, and one distilling creature. And of course, it would be here that Jack would find his calling. Something about Jack caught Dan's eye, and he saw real potential in the little tyke.
This boy's gonna make a fine whiskey one day, I tell you what.
And so, according to company history, an 8-year-old Jack began learning the art and science of distillation from one Nathan Green, a master distiller and slave under Dan Call. Fast forward several years and Dan hit a crossroad. Given an ultimatum by his wife, Dan had to choose between his relationship with his tasty spirits or the Holy Spirit. The Reverend chose his Lord and Savior, saving his soul and his liver in the process. In that choice, Dan had sold his prized distillery to none other than his favorite pupil, Jack Daniel, whose first act as new owner was to hire on his friend and mentor Nathan Green as the company's master distiller. He also employed Nathan's 2 adult sons and, later down the line, his grandsons. Now, the Jack Daniels website really emphasizes that Jack never owned slaves. So if you disagree, don't look at me. I'm just a guy on the internet. A man of all business and no pleasure, Jack never married nor had any children of his own. He did, however, take his nephews under his wing to learn the business, eventually handing the distillery down to them in 1907 once his health bar had reached a solid yellow. But it would be a few years later in 1911 before Jack would kick the bucket, or in this case, something much heavier. According to legend, Jack Daniel, now in his 60s or so, had forgotten the combination to a personal safe housing a bunch of valuables like safes are typically designed to do. In his frustration, Jack tried to solve the problem in true US Southerner fashion, by putting a boot up its ass. But since a safe has buns of literal steel, Jack instead broke his toe, causing a severe blood infection. Jack Daniel reportedly died of blood poisoning on October 9th, 1911. But is this story true? I don't know. Here's a rather recent one for you. Back in 1993, when the world was witnessing the birth of the internet, Czechoslovakia was checking out, and President Clinton was gearing up to suck or be sucked at his job, Gary Hoy was about to meet his untimely death. An extremely successful business partner and corporate and securities law specialist for the Holden Day Wilson law firm in Toronto, Canada, Gary was living it up. But he would quickly learn that it's a long fall from the top. Gary had a reputation as a very personable guy, always loving to talk to people, share wisdom, and loved cracking a few jokes here and there. But on July 9th, 1993, one of Gary's jokes would fall flat. While attending a reception in the office on a Friday, Gary decided to give a tour of the office to a group of accounting and law students, which of course was a typical routine for Gary's charismatic character. But what happens next would be cemented in the minds of everyone around him. While on the tour of the 24th floor office, Gary decided to whip out his signature move. Boasting about the structural integrity of Canadian architecture and the seemingly unbreakable glass office windows, Gary charged full speed towards one of said windows, a party trick he apparently had performed successfully many times in the past. Typical Gary. But this time, He was also successful. Gary bounced right off of the glass without a hitch, to the applause and laughter of the students. You wanna see me do it again?
Yeah!
No, not really. Gary was about to push his luck, and a little too hard on the window. Gary charged once more, hitting the glass at a sprint. Now, to his credit, the glass didn't break, but the entire window frame dislodged from its setting, causing Gary to plunge the full 24 stories to his death. The students and various colleagues stood paralyzed and horror-struck after witnessing Gary's fall, not to mention the witnesses on the ground where Hoy's body had landed. Following the incident, many of the firm's lawyers received professional counseling, but some chose to part ways with the company, eventually leading to its full closure in 1996. Talk about having a falling out. Each of us wants to accomplish our own big motivational concrete goals before crossing the eternal finish line. A loving family, traveling the world, subscribing to this channel, which you can do right now. But as the Rolling Stones once said, you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, I forget the rest. Anyway, this is Frank Hayes, and he has his own goal, to win a race. A horse race. Problem is though, he is no professional jockey. A young Irish fella born in Ireland in 1901, Frank grew up as a stable boy and eventually an apprentice horse trainer under James Frayling, a wealthy gent who owned and bred professional racing horses. Paying close attention to Frank's rather small stature, Frayling gave Frank an opportunity to race as a jockey. And he lost. But apparently not too bad, because he was given a second chance in 1923. One small snag in this plan, however, was that Frank was a tad too heavy. Jockeys were required to weigh less than 130 pounds in order to qualify for racing. Ideally, the slimmer and sleeker your jockey is, the less of a burden he is for the horse, allowing for a higher potential speed. Less mass, go fast. And so Frank was given a doozy of a task. Lose 12 pounds in a few days. And that's a big ask for someone already in a healthy weight range, but Frank was determined to strap in the saddle once more. Through what I can only imagine were extremely unhealthy choices, the frail Frank ended up making the cut and was given the thumbs up to participate in the race, though he was nowhere near expected to win, with him and his horse only given 20-1 odds. On June 4th, 1923, Frank mounted his horse named Sweet Kiss and prepared to travel around the track. The racers were off, and Sweet Kiss quickly trailed behind the group. However, in the final stretch, Sweet Kiss apparently kicked in maximum overdrive and managed to close the gap, with Frank appearing locked in, closely hugging the horse's neck. In an extreme upset, Sweet Kiss actually won the race by a pretty respectable lead. But after dropping from a gallop to a canter to a walk, Frank was still closely gripping the steed. Frank Hayes was dead. During the race, Frank's heart gave out, presumably from the extreme and unhealthily fast weight drop sustained to get into the race in the first place. So yeah, Sweet Kiss carried a corpse across the finish line. Frank Hayes photo finished into the great beyond at the age of 22. Or 35, depending on whatever source you read. I know that's a big discrepancy, but welcome to history. Unfortunately, Sweet Kiss, now superstitiously dubbed Sweet Kiss of Death, never ran another race as jockeys refused to mount the mare, fearing a similar fate. So of course, it was the end of her show, and she got her final curtain call.
Human sacrifice is a noble tradition that has been going on since the dawn of civilization. Whether it's to make your king happy, appease the gods, or just a creative way of getting rid of an annoying neighbor, you can bet that a classic heart-stealing, skull-splitting sacrifice will get the job done. So let's take a look at how different societies used to willingly depopulate themselves for the greater good. Imagine you spend most, if not all of your life serving one guy. The Pharaoh. Well, one day he just keels over from choking on a scarab and you say to yourself, oh thank God, your years of servitude are over. Only to find out that the Pharaoh handpicked you and your buddies to serve him in the afterlife. To make matters worse, you look around to see all of your bros celebrating like Ra himself just showed up to the party. Are you fucking kidding me? You say to yourself as a sword is rammed into your delicate tummy. Your body is then mummified and you're entombed with Pharaoh and the boys for all eternity. This is basically how retainer sacrifices went. Since pharaohs were seen as gods in human form, they were treated as such, requiring countless servants to tend to their every need. Like a lot of civilizations, ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife where you could continue to do what you do without the fragility of mortality. Of course, pharaohs didn't want to spend eternity having to do things themselves. That's for poor people. So there were instances where pharaohs would arrange to have servants or even close family members sacrificed to accompany them into the next life. Evidence shows that those chosen for eternal untipped servitude willingly gave their lives as a sign of everlasting devotion to their pharaoh. Dumbasses. Examination of the bodies showed no signs of struggle or trauma, suggesting that they most likely cast themselves into the shadow realm sipping on an arsenic brewski. Retainer sacrifices were rare, and some of the only evidence of its practice dates back to the first dynasty of Egypt around 3000 BC, but it has also been seen in other ancient cultures like Sumerians and Chinese, though the practice seemed to have faded in popularity as time went on. My guess is the pool for volunteers dried up once they realized they could just be like, "Yeah, sure, Pharaoh, we'll be right behind you." Wink. Imagine you take the time to build a nice bridge to cross a pesky river. That's a nice bridge right there. But it suddenly gets washed away by a rush of water because rivers, am I right? Oh toots, you say, slapping your knee, but you don't let it get you down just yet. You can rebuild, and so you do, but damn it! Looks like something really doesn't want you building a bridge there. The gods? A nature spirit? Poor structural integrity from a lack of engineering experience? Whatever the case, you're left with no choice. You have to reliably cross that river. It's time to start sacrificing! Japan is no stranger to odd practices to appease spirits, and Hitobashira is one of them. Translating to human pillar, the practice was used to basically bless new construction projects with good fortune. Dang, this project is 3 weeks behind schedule. Well, in you go, Martha. Sir, the budgets have just been coincidentally increased. It's a miracle! It was a common belief that disturbing the earth for means of construction would piss off the local spirits around the land, cursing the structure to an untimely demise. Well, that's not so great for the portfolio's ROI, so builders needed some insurance that their castles and bridges were going to at least have a few centuries of durability against some spooky specters. Victims, or volunteers, would be handpicked to sacrifice themselves to serve this greater purpose. In their sacrifice, they would become a guardian spirit for the structure, protecting it from natural elements or enemy attacks. To be honest, I'd give up my life so a Denny's could serve for all eternity. Famous sites that use some human reinforcement are the Maruoka Castle in Sakai and the Matsuejo Castle in Matsue. Those being sacrificed would be provided a small, comfy hole in which to be buried alive, forever entombed under or near the new construction. The practice was common up until the 16th century when people started to realize, yeah, that makes no sense, and declared it inhumane. Although there is evidence that the practice continued up to the 20th century. I guess some traditions just don't die, but the people do. Mayans. Probably the first thing you think of when you hear human sacrifice in your everyday conversations. Decapitation, ripping out hearts, throwing people in pits, they had it all. Dating as far back as 250 AD, the Mayan people were big on human sacrifice as an ultimate offering to the gods if they really wanted something dire, be it fertility to save them from famine, or rainfall to save them from drought. The unfortunate thing is that droughts and famine eventually subside naturally, so the Mayans never got a good feedback loop that their sacrifices were in vain. They really just kept doing it until their problems were solved, and to their credit, there was definitely no lack of imagination on how to lower their population density either. Those eligible for the privilege of getting sliced and diced onto the village charcuterie board were typically high-value prisoners of war from rival societies, as they were seen as a better offering to the gods. These smelly, unpopular captives would typically be forced into labor, building all of the structures that their friends just died for. Oh yeah, ritualistic offerings were also performed for things like new construction or appointing a new ruler. Nothing like breaking ground by shoving the shovel into your buddy's skull. Thanks, gods. The main goal of sacrifice was to extract blood from their victims as tribute. Of course, getting your sacrifice to bleed was the easy part, but Mayans like to put on a good show. Lobbing heads off, ripping their still beating hearts from their chests, and chucking their bodies down a bunch of steps, slamming numerous arrows into their chests, simple cutting and draining, all very effective at getting that sweet red good out from their bodies. The blood was often smeared across images of the gods that they wished to appease, with the remaining blood and corpsey bits burned to complete the tribute. In case you were wondering, Aztecs performed very similar sacrifices, though a bit more grand. For example, during the reconsecration of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, it is estimated that more than 80,000 prisoners were sacrificed, reducing crime rate 143% overnight. Even though we are grateful every day for the invention of olive oil, Greece has a pretty dark history. When times were looking grim thanks to the usual suspects of famine, war, or plague, it was deemed necessary to make a sacrifice to purify the community. Roughly translating to scapegoat, pharmakos was the ritualistic sacrifice or exile of a person or group of people. Those typically chosen for the task were slaves, cripples, or criminals. You could even be chosen if you were just plain ugly. Those people were seen as impure and a blight on their society, thus causing all of the misfortunes. Tomatoes not growing right? Just blame Nasty Nick down the road. Yeah, he's guilty. The ritual can go one of two ways. Either the victim is completely sacrificed, or is just exiled. Typically, full-on sacrifice was reserved for the worst of criminals, where they could just be thrown off a cliff into the sea or burned on a pyre. Although it has to be said that many modern history dorks say this probably never happened, so who knows? There are stories from Athens that each year during a harvest festival called Thargelia, the ugliest man and woman would be well fed and paraded through the city. This is nice. But then they would just get absolutely demolished with sticks and branches and kicked out of the city. Well, that's what you get for ruining my tomatoes. Marriage can be one of the happiest moments in a person's life. You dedicate the rest of your life ensuring prosperity, safety, and care for your partner. But what happens once till death do you part becomes reality? Why, you sacrifice yourself, of course. Back around 320 AD, Hindu women would often opt into the practice of sati, in which they would sacrifice themselves to the funeral pyre of their recently deceased husbands. This was seen as an ultimate sacrifice and a sign of utmost devotion as they would follow their loved ones into the spirit world. The grieving widows would either softly lay next to their dearly departed or 720 laser flip their way onto the funeral pyre as it burned, which was pretty metal. As time went on, women became a little bit more reluctant to just throwing themselves willy-nilly into fire because, maybe they wanted to live instead? But thanks to good old societal pressures, these women were more or less forced to the flame. Widows who had no children were seen as nothing but a burden on society since they could not remarry and therefore had no further use. According to a website I found when researching this, the practice of sati was highest between the 15th and 18th centuries, with as many as 1,000 widows blazing it each year. I mean, I've heard of hot single women in my area, but this is ridiculous. Thankfully, the practice was officially banned in 1829. So there you have it. Societies have gone through a lot of sacrifices throughout history and still do even today. For example, I sacrifice my time making these videos trying to convince you that I'm funny, and you sacrifice your time confirming that I'm not. But hey, that's showbiz, baby. If you're gonna be executed, you'd probably want the process to be relatively quick and painless, be it one fell swoop from the guillotine, a short drop and a sudden stop, or just getting injected with night-night juice. But sometimes, things don't go according to plan. So let's see how it all went wrong for a few poor unfortunate souls. If you're getting your melon chopped off, you're gonna want two things, a sharp blade and a trained executioner. Poor Margaret Pole got maybe one of those. Once the very wealthy Countess of Salisbury, not the steak, Margaret fell from the good graces of King Henry VIII when she went all girl boss on him for divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry brushed this off, but was set over the edge when Margaret's very influential Catholic cardinal son, Reginald Pole, also scolded him, but from a safe distance over in Italy.
Hey Henry, you suck!
The proud Protestant king responded, being all, alright, bet, and imprisoned Margaret, Reginald, and the rest of her family in the Tower of London.
That'll teach you.
Margaret was held for 2.5 years in the Tower in actually pretty fair conditions, with her own personal servants and lavish clothing, until one morning when she got a surprise visitor. Hey Margaret, how's it going? You look great, by the way. I love that dress. So listen, yeah, you're gonna be executed today. Okay, bye. That morning on May 27th, 1541, Margaret was led to a courtyard to have her dome knocked off. Unfortunately for her, the main executioner had been sent away to fight some rebels, so his intern filled in. Generally, executions are supposed to be swift and smooth. Not this one. The inexperienced executioner couldn't chop worth shit, so he ended up just hacking Margaret's back and neck to bits. Oops. 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 It took 11 swings to finally detach head from body. Now, if you're going to be executed, you might as well have done something pretty cool to deserve it. Take Robert François Damier, for example. As a very French man, he hated his very French king, King Louis XV, because reasons. Well, in 1757, he decided to channel that hatred into something productive, like developing an elaborate plan to kill the king. As the merry monarch was entering his carriage at the Palace of Versailles, Damier mashed the A button to rush past the bodyguards and stab the king with a penknife. Fortunately for King Louis, his thick-ass royal king coat was thick enough to stop the pen from doing any severe damage, and the pen only penetrated less than half of an inch into his chest, causing nothing but a flesh wound. Damier was immediately arrested, convicted, and sentenced to be drawn and quartered by horses. Now, if you're unfamiliar with such an execution method, it's exactly as it sounds. No, not that. There we go. A rope is tied around each limb and strapped to a horse. 4 limbs, 4 horses. They then pull in opposite directions until your limbs pop out of their sockets one by one. Real fun stuff. Well, that's how it's supposed to go. Reportedly, Damier had stubborn anatomy that just refused to separate at all. So, to make things a little bit easier, his arms and legs had their tendons cut to make the ripping easier. After his last limb detached, he was reported to have still been alive. So his stumpy, bloody torso was burned to finish the job. Bit overkill for a little scratch with a penknife, but whatever. Thomas Ketchum, who has no relation to the world-famous Pokemon trainer, was an infamous American outlaw who would give Arthur Morgan a run for his money.
Quack, quack.
Ketchum, also known as Black Jack, had his own posse of cowboys for some rootin' tootin', robbin' and shootin'. Ketchum and his gang terrorized the Wild West in the late 1800s with a string of shootouts, robberies, murders, but they had bigger ambitions with heftier payouts. That's when Tom decided to go for gold. Literal gold. On trains. He was gonna rob trains. With his brother Sam at his side, the two robbed trains to the tune of a modern-day equivalent of a few $1 million over the years. But eventually, their luck ran out. On a solo run, Sam was injured in a shootout, arrested, and died of an infection of his wounds a few days later. Tom, unaware that his brother just bit the dust robbing a train, made an attempt on the very same train just a month later. At this point, the train conductor's a little sick of getting robbed, so he pulled an Uno reverse card on Tom, using a shotgun to blast away his elbow. The train chugged away and Tom was left injured on the wayside, where he was later arrested by law enforcement. For his countless crimes over the years, Tom was sentenced to death by hanging. Unfortunately for Tom, though, the small New Mexico town had no experience actually hanging a man, so they did the best they could. Gallows? Check. Prisoner? Check. Length of hanging rope? I don't know. The gallows were tested with a 200-pound sack of flour, which seemed to have been successful. But the problem here is that the same rope that was tested was reused for the execution, so that 200-pound sack made the rope really tight. Since Tom was notorious at this point, crowds flocked to witness his execution. On April 26, 1901, the rope was placed around Tom's neck and the trapdoor was sprung. The townsfolk ended up getting way more than they bargained for. The long, tight rope instantly decapitated Tom once he reached the apex of his final descent. He should have quit, but now he's just ahead. But at least he made a cool postcard. Hey, quick side note here. So I'm realizing that there's like no image resources for this section, so I hope you don't mind some crude artwork. King Kalorso GL was the second woman in Thai history to be put to death by gunfire. Being a nanny to the 6-year-old son of a wealthy business family, she was promptly fired because... But that didn't sit too well with her. In a desperate attempt to get some money, she, along with several accomplices, had kidnapped the 6-year-old for ransom. They had demanded 200,000 Thai baht, or $6,000, for the release of the boy. After the terrified family failed to follow the exact directions of where to bring the ransom money, the young boy was brutally beaten and buried alive. GL had attempted to save the boy with whom she had grown fond of, but failed to do so. GL and her accomplices were quickly arrested and sentenced to death by firing squad. Now, Thailand did firing squads a bit different from what you'd expect. Instead of lining a blindfolded prisoner to a wall with several gunmen taking aim, the prisoner is instead tied facing backward on a wooden cross. A concealing screen is put up with a target pointing in the vicinity of the prisoner's heart, and a rifle is lined up to the target. A single executioner is instructed to fire up to 15 shots at the target, guaranteeing the prisoner's death. On January 13th, 1979, GL was executed and carted off to the morgue, and all seemed to have been successful. But that thought quickly evaporated once GL was found screaming her frickin' head off in the morgue and attempting to stand up. But why wasn't the execution successful, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you if you just wait a minute. Jeez. It turns out that GL's genetics played a prank on her. She was diagnosed with situs inversus, meaning that all of her organs were mirrored to how they normally should be, with her heart on her right side of her chest rather than her left. So those initial shots all missed her heart entirely, and instead of killing her, just ended up hurting a lot. She was instantly pulled from the morgue, set up once more on the cross, and given another volley of justice seeds to the back. When it comes to new inventions, they usually go through rigorous testing and tweaks to perfect their function before being put on the market for commercial use. Well, since the electric chair wasn't a commercial product, who cares? Improvements can be made later on once enough testing is performed. William Kemmler was such a test subject. A poor businessman and a drunk, Kemmler often found himself in trouble. According to an article in the New York Times, on March 29, 1889, Kemmler was recovering from a drinking binge the night before when he became enraged with his wife, Tilly Ziegler. He accused her of stealing from him and preparing to run away with a friend of his. When the argument had reached a peak, Kemmler calmly went to the barn out back, grabbed a hatchet, and returned to the house. He struck Tilly repeatedly, killing her. He then went to a neighbor's house and announced that he had just murdered his wife. Kemmler was arrested, swiftly convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to be executed by a brand new invention. On August 6, 1890, Kemmler was brought to the chair. He reportedly did not resist in any way and willingly accepted his punishment. After being secured and wishing everyone farewell, the switch was thrown. 1,000 volts were put through Kemmler's body for 17 agonizing seconds. Kemmler was unconscious, but alive. The voltage was doubled and power was thrown again. This is where things became spectacular. It was reported by witnesses that Kemmler's blood vessels ruptured and bled under his skin and his entire body caught fire. The entire execution room filled with the foul odor of burning flesh, causing many witnesses to panic and flee. The execution lasted 8 terrifying minutes. An autopsy showed that Kemmler's skull had burnt to a crisp and his brain cooked to a tender medium rare.
It looks stunning.
The New York Times later published a review stating that the executioner would have done better with an axe.